Bosses in the Versus games have generally come in two distinct flavors. You'll either get powerful, regular-sized opponents like Cyber Akuma or God Rugal, or unique giant bosses like Ultron Omega, Yami, or Abyss. These boss fights tend to be pretty interesting, since you can't tackle them like you would a regular-sized opponent. Instead, almost playing out more like a boss fight in the 2D action scroller that just so happens to use fighting game controls. It's a fun way to escalate a boss's threat level within the bounds of the game's design. All of the Versus series bosses in this mode, like Onslaught and Galactus, have one specific boss to thank for setting the blueprint for this brand of boss design.
I am the Apocalypse!
Apocalypse, born En Sabanur, is one of the oldest mutants in the Marvel Universe and one of the biggest threats to the X-Men corner of the universe in particular. Despite being one of the most important mutants in the X-Men universe, Apocalypse's conception came about as a result of a writer leaving a book earlier than anticipated. Apocalypse debuted in the pages of X-Factor, a team book starring the original 5 X-Men that splintered off from the main Uncanny team when Magneto began leading them. X-Factor posed as a for-hire anti-mutant organization that in reality was a cover for their true purpose, finding mutants and helping them get their powers under control. From the book's beginning, writer Bob Layton began planting seeds of a villain mastermind pulling the strings behind the scenes. He had intended for issue 5 to reveal that the main villain was the Owl, best known as an adversary of Daredevil and Spider-Man. Layton left the book after submitting the script for issue 5, with writing duties for the series being handed to Louise Simonson instead. She had already come up with a rough concept for the character that would serve as an arch-nemesis for the X-Factor team, so when Layton left, the last page of the issue that featured the Owl was instead redone to feature this new Apocalypse character instead. Apocalypse is an immortal mutant born in ancient times that has full control and manipulation of his molecular structure, allowing him to shapeshift, alter his size, and adapt to his surroundings at will, among other things. At one point, Apocalypse comes across technology left on Earth by the Celestials, incredibly powerful cosmic beings that exist in the Marvel Universe, and is able to become one with it, augmenting his powers and vastly expanding his array of supernatural abilities. Some of these include being able to absorb and project energy, as well as being able to conjure up and transform his body into all kinds of weapons and technology. Apocalypse notably has a survival of the fittest mentality that he operates on. Everything he does is in service of weeding out the weak and bringing about the rise of Homo Superior. This would later be expanded on further, explaining that his desire to foster the strongest of mutant kind was done in preparation for the return of his wife and children, who had originally sacrificed themselves to save the mutant population of Okara, a sentient island that would be split into two across dimensions, Arakko and the more commonly known Krakoa. Though Apocalypse is effectively immortal, he frequently uses regeneration chambers to preserve his body over extended periods of time, his earliest one being made by confiscating technology in ancient Egypt from Pharaoh Rama-Tut, who in truth was one of many incarnations of the time traveler King the Conqueror. Given Apocalypse has existed for a very long time, he's come across many fixtures in the Marvel Universe long before they've made their marks. He's come across everyone from Odin, Circe, and Dracula, and is directly involved with the rise of people like Exodus and Mr. Sinister. Of all the X-Men and X-Men adjacent characters Apocalypse has had conflict with over the years, he's perhaps most closely tied to Nathan Summers, the mutant known as Cable. Knowing that Nathan has the potential to be the biggest threat to him, Apocalypse has a newborn Nathan abducted and infected with the techno-organic virus, forcing him to be sent into the future where Clan Ascani, a group of people dedicated to opposing Apocalypse, can cure him. At this point, it goes without saying that Apocalypse is a big-time X-Men villain, almost always requiring a joint effort from across mutant kind to defeat. He's been the main villainous force behind movies, video games, and entire seasons of at least 2 separate X-Men cartoons. X-Men the Animated Series in particular has a popular depiction of him, thanks to some pretty incredibly written lines.
I am the rocks of the eternal shore. Crash against me and be broken!
You promised to destroy Lilandra!
I lied.
One notable aspect of Apocalypse's ambitions is his personally appointed guard, usually referred to as his horsemen, named after the biblical concept. Various people over time have served as horsemen for him, his aforementioned wife and children being his first horsemen, to characters like Wolverine, Hulk, Gambit, Banshee, and Psylocke, though his most famous horseman by far is the mutant Angel, who would become Archangel under Apocalypse's influence. Apocalypse being such a big mutant-centric threat is perhaps why he was chosen to be the main antagonist and final boss of X-Men vs. Street Fighter. The game doesn't really have much of a plot, but the general setup is that Apocalypse has been kidnapping both mutants and Street Fighter characters alike, and characters from both the X-Men and Street Fighter franchises join forces to stop him. Apocalypse is voiced in this game, as well as its sequel Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter by Lauren Kennedy. Kennedy notably also provided the voice of Magneto and Doctor Doom in Marvel Superheroes and Marvel vs. Capcom 2, as well as providing the voice of the former in X-Men vs. Street Fighter as well. Though he's a boss character, he has been playable in a roundabout way in a few specific console ports of the Versus games, so there's still some moveset stuff to talk about here. Let's get started. Apocalypse is unplayable in the arcade game without hacking, but the PlayStation port of the game, despite its many shortcomings, does allow Apocalypse to be used exclusively in Versus mode. To unlock him, beat arcade mode on 5-star difficulty or higher, then go to Versus mode, highlight Akuma, hold select for 6 seconds, and then press any punch button. Apocalypse only has a handful of moves he can use, but they do at least give you access to his entire boss moveset. First is a shockwave attack, done with a quarter circle down and punch, the punch strength dictating the size and range of the shockwave.
Good. Good. Your right is mine. Good.
Second is hammer crush, done with a dragon punch and any punch. Third is shoulder cannon, done with a quarter circle forward and medium kick.
Marvelous!
This one is interesting, because Apocalypse will randomly choose between 1 or 2 variations of this attack. One that fires a projectile that splits into other, smaller projectiles, and one that locks onto the opponent before firing a rapid stream of larger projectiles. This variation does more chip damage. Speaking of chip damage, Apocalypse's most infamous attack is its drill, done with a quarter circle forward and heavy punch.
Marvelous!
This does massive damage on hit or on block, though it's easily telegraphed by Apocalypse quickly dashing off screen. The attack can also be more or less nullified if you push block it. Apocalypse, having total control over the molecular structure of his body, can alter his shape into different weapons at will. But it bears mentioning that an arm drill was a part of Apocalypse's arsenal in another Capcom game he featured as a boss in, X-Men Mutant Apocalypse on the Super Nintendo. Apocalypse also has a passive attack, these little satellites. Every once in a while, they'll fire off a laser that can bound off of the other satellite, then right into the player. These can be temporarily destroyed by Apocalypse's opponent, though they come back after a bit. That said, as a boss, Apocalypse is pretty easy overall. His drill attack is by far the most dangerous thing about him, but it's also easily solved by super jumping when he dashes away, or just push blocking as mentioned earlier. If you play as him using cheats in the arcade version, Apocalypse actually has an additional attack, though it seems unfinished and it doesn't do any damage. He transforms his hand into a weapon and generates a sphere of energy. You can see him do it by doing a quarter circle forward and light kick motion. There is no collision detection or hitboxes programmed for the attack, but it does look pretty cool. Apocalypse's stage in this game is Apocalypse Now. This stage, as well as Apocalypse's general appearance in this game, is taken directly from the pages of X Factor issues 67 and 68. Which saw X Factor and the Inhumans launch a joint assault on Apocalypse's lunar citadel to rescue baby Nathan Summers. The innermost part of the citadel is where the stage takes place, giving you a pretty nice view of outer space and the Earth in the background. Apocalypse's giant form in the Versus series is also inspired by these X Factor issues. This was the very first time Apocalypse used his powers to expand his size that much, something Cyclops himself notes during the fight in the comics. There's all kinds of tubing and wiring littering the stage, giving a bit of context to the stage's most memorable feature: capsules adorning both corners of the stage featuring captured mutants and Street Fighter characters. This too is also taken from the same X Factor story that inspired the stage. If you get knocked into or attack the capsules closest to the foreground, you can actually break them and free the imprisoned character. On the left, we have Psylocke and a very terrified Dan. And in the upper left, we have 4 capsules, though one is initially obscured. First seems to be what looks like Forge. Next to him was a mystery to me as a kid for a pretty long time, but given the complexion and the red mask looking eyewear, I'm pretty sure this is X-Force era Sunspot. On the farthest side of these 4 is Blanca. If you break those first 2 capsules, another one becomes visible, showing Shuma Gorath. Let's be real here. Shuma is probably canonically the strongest character in any Versus game, Marvel or otherwise, so Apocalypse shouldn't have had an easy time capturing them. I have to imagine Shuma was probably just really bored and let it happen for shits and giggles. After all, Shuma's not above being silly if the other games in the series are any indication. On the other side here, I'm gonna be real, I'm still not quite clear on who these 2 are exactly. The one on the far right almost kind of reminds me of the animated series design for Morph, but I'm pretty sure that's not them. And the one next to them, I'm definitely drawing a blank on. If anyone knows who these 2 are, please let me know in the comments. This has haunted me for years. You can see Beast in the far left capsule, and if you break the first 2, a second capsule comes into view of Sakura in it. Apocalypse's theme is composed by Yuko Takahara. I've mentioned before that she's composed for Mega Man games, but it should be noted that for most of the games she composed up to that point, she also had a hand in the final boss theme, including Mega Man 6 and 7, Mega Man 2 The Power Fighters, and Star Gladiator. In the Japanese release of the game, Apocalypse has unique dialogue with whatever character you have in the first character slot when you challenge him. This was cut from the English versions of the game though. Instead, just having the characters have a weird little stare down before Apocalypse transforms and begins the fight. Thanks to the folks at Chimplations, the English translated quotes are out there, and I'd also like to give a shout out to RageQuitter87 for hosting them in a convenient place as well.
The apocalypse. The apocalypse. The apocalypse. The apocalypse. Ready, the apocalypse. Ready, the apocalypse. Ready, the apocalypse. The apocalypse.
Come on, mon ami.
Ready,
Apocalypse, being such a big part of the mutant corner of the Marvel Universe, has quite a few stories worth reading. Rise of Apocalypse details his younger years in Egypt and how the ideals of his adopted father, as well as his conflicts with the pharaoh Ramatut, influenced his beliefs down the line as Apocalypse. The first 6 issues of X Factor cover Apocalypse's first appearance and work as a good way to familiarize yourself with him. And the Endgame arc, comprised of issues 65 through 68 in particular, cover his abduction of Nathan and X Factor's attempt to rescue him. Read this one if you want to see where Capcom took most of the design notes for him from. Executioner's Song is also a great story featuring Apocalypse, though keep in mind that some of the character designs in it are 90s as hell. More recently, during Dawn of X, the first issues of Excalibur leading up to the Ten of Swords event by Jonathan Hickman has a lot of Apocalypse lore that's honestly pretty great. Though Excalibur itself is a pretty dense read that's honestly pretty hard to sit through if you're not already invested in X-Men stuff. I'd say read Ten of Swords and dive into Excalibur only if you want additional context. As much as I try to shine a light on more underrated stories for comic book recommendations every now and then, sometimes the best ones are the most obvious. Comic book fans probably already know where I'm going with this. This video's comic book recommendation is the 1995 X-Men event Age of Apocalypse. I was admittedly too young to appreciate the launch of Age of Apocalypse, but it's one of those things like the reveal at the end of the first issue of Thunderbolts that simply couldn't be done today due to how prevalent the internet and leaks are. Age of Apocalypse is an alternate timeline where Apocalypse conquers the planet after a failed attempt to assassinate Magneto in the past by Legion ends with Xavier dead instead, leaving the world ripe for Apocalypse to invade earlier than he did in the main continuity. What was notable about Age of Apocalypse was that every single X book at the time was instantly pulled into the story, and every book was rebranded and retitled to fit with their place in the new timeline. The Wolverine ongoing book suddenly became Weapon X, following the Age of Apocalypse's version of Wolverine. X Factor became Factor X. Cable's book became X-Man, featuring the alternate universe version of Cable, Nate Gray, and so on. In this universe, with the death of Xavier, Magneto is the one who ends up taking up his dream of peaceful coexistence between humans and mutant kind. Apocalypse rules with an iron fist though, and orders cullings, which are generally massive executions of humans, which Magneto and his X-Men work to stop. The only person with any memories of the original timeline as it's supposed to be is Bishop, who's trying to get back to the point in time that started this mess in the first place, Xavier's death. The X-Men the Animated Series 2-part episode, One Man's Worth, seems to be inspired by Age of Apocalypse's general setup, but in truth, it's actually the other way around. The script for those 2 episodes actually inspired Age of Apocalypse's creation. Because animation production takes significantly longer than comic production, however, Age of Apocalypse debuted first in February of 1995, with One Man's Worth not airing until September of that same year. The production staff for X-Men the Animated Series was known to work closely with the staff at Marvel, and X-Men the Animated Series was known to have some production issues, particularly in the animation department, so all of that tracks. The easiest way to read this today would be to either track down the Age of Apocalypse Omnibus release, or read it on Marvel Unlimited. Both methods also include the 4 Uncanny X-Men and regular X-Men issues that make up Legion Quest, the story that directly leads into this timeline being created. Despite being an alternate reality, the impact this story has had on the X-Men universe was wide and far-reaching. Several characters specific to this reality would end up coming over to the main 616 Marvel universe. The Age of Apocalypse version of Blink would be brought over, and she'd end up founding the Exiles, a multiversal team of heroes from alternate realities. Nate Gray would make it over and become a pivotal part of stories like the Onslaught Saga and Age of X-Man, which itself is a nod to Age of Apocalypse. And most notably, the Age of Apocalypse version of Beast, more commonly known as Dark Beast, jumped over to the main universe. Dark Beast is pretty much Beast with the amorality ratcheted up to 11, though his main timeline counterpart would slowly but surely start matching and even exceeding him in those regards too. The setting has been revisited a few times afterwards as well, like in the 2005 sequel miniseries celebrating the book's 10th anniversary, and most notably in Rick Remender's fantastic run on Uncanny X-Force in the Dark Angel saga, where X-Force travels to that reality to prevent Archangel from becoming the next Apocalypse. Despite the large scale of the event, it's thankfully not difficult to follow, and it's really just good 90s flavored comic book fun. I definitely recommend reading it if you already haven't. It's one of the most iconic X-Men stories for a reason. Apocalypse appeared in the next Versus game, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, though this time he's the game's sub-boss, with the true final boss being Cyber Akuma. He's again unplayable in the arcade version of the game, and only playable in the PlayStation port, making Apocalypse one of a handful of characters in the entire series to be console exclusive. To unlock him, beat the game on any difficulty setting without continuing. Afterwards, select Arcade, Training or Versus mode, highlight Akuma, and press select 6 times and then press any punch button. All of his usable attacks from X-Men vs. Street Fighter are here, though he does have one new attack. Quarter circle forward and heavy kick now initiates a rushing eye laser attack that hits multiple times and does a decent bit of damage. Notably, his playable presence has been expanded from X-Men vs. Street Fighter. Where he could only be used in Versus mode in that game, he can now be used in Arcade mode, Training mode, and Versus mode, with Arcade mode being a series of fights taking place on a stage against multiple CPU opponents. This would kinda become the blueprint for playable bosses in subsequent Marvel vs. games, specifically Onslaught and the console ports of Marvel vs. Capcom 1, and Galactus and Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. His theme is once again composed by Yuko Takahara. It's an original theme, but it does sound like a pretty fitting follow-up to the X-Men vs. Street Fighter theme, almost like a part 2 to that song. Apocalypse Now, like every other stage from X-Men vs. Street Fighter, gets slightly remixed for the sequel. The background is a bit different, though the location of the stage itself is the same. There's some new cameos in the containment capsules in the background though. On the right, you can see Elektra and Balrog captured, with Elektra in particular occasionally hitting the capsule in an attempt to break out. In the top left, Forge and Sunspot are still there, but where Shuma and Blanca were in the previous game is now occupied by Ghost Rider and Guile, who appears to be in communication with someone on a walkie-talkie. In the top right are the 2 mutants from the X-Men vs. Street Fighter stage, but behind them are Storm and Charlie, who appears to be the other person Guile was communicating with. Funny little thing here, even if you use Shadow on this stage and get here, Charlie's still in the capsule. Beating Arcade mode with Apocalypse in the PS1 version just gives you the generic ending that most of the secret characters in the game get as well. Unlike X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Apocalypse's pre-fight dialogue with the cast was implemented in releases of the game outside of Japan. Norimaro even has English dialogue with him, despite being dummied out of the game internationally. Here's his interactions with the cast.
Let's go, Cubs.
The secret characters don't have unique interactions with Apocalypse, instead reusing the dialogue that their counterpart uses, with the only change being that Apocalypse will correctly address the secret character by name. Shadow in particular actually straight up reuses Akuma's interaction with Apocalypse for some reason. That said, all of that is only true for the English release. In the Japanese release though, Dark Sakura, Mech Zangief, and Shadow all have new dialogue with Apocalypse that isn't in the English release, and weirdly enough, not really documented anywhere on the internet that I could find. I'll be showing a rough translation of the dialogue here, but I want to stress that it's very rough and more so a direct literal translation, so I apologize in advance for any awkward reading text. The charm of the Versus games, and particularly the Marvel and Tatsunoko crossovers, are the over-the-top, larger-than-life design decisions of those games. Apocalypse is that ideal made into reality. Without him, we probably wouldn't have gotten some of the other big bosses in the series, and even if he is hilariously easy to actually fight, the precedent he set speaks for itself. He does get name-dropped by Akuma in Marvel 3 in a win quote against Wolverine though, specifically nodding to Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. While Apocalypse would go on to be a threat in other X-Men games like X-Men Legends 2 and Reign of Apocalypse, he notably hadn't really appeared in any other fighting games afterwards. He was in the Mutant Academy series, but only in the first game, and exclusively only in the Game Boy Color version, so
Yeah.
Apocalypse is more than likely going to be big in the public eye in the near future, so it's only a matter of time before he'd start showing up in things again. All that said, that's going to do it for this video. As always, thanks for watching, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.